The studio lights glowed softly over the dark set, and the air felt heavy with the kind of silence that comes before something big. Cameras adjusted, audience members shifted in their seats, and behind the glass, producers whispered like people waiting for a storm to begin. At the center of it all sat Whoopi Goldberg, calm but alert, her expression sharp and unreadable. Across from her was Ibrahim Traoré, the young African leader whose voice had shaken governments and inspired crowds across continents. He sat straight, eyes steady, his hands resting quietly on the table. The mood in the room was tense but strange, like everyone knew they were about to hear something they wouldn't forget. Whoopi leaned forward, her tone polite but carrying a hidden edge. She smiled, the kind of smile that feels safe until the words that follow cut deep. "You talk about freedom and justice," she said slowly, "but do you really think the world is ready to be led by someone like you?" The words hung in the air like smoke. A few people in the audience looked at each other, unsure if they should clap or stay silent. The camera zoomed in on Ibrahim's face. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He lowered his gaze for a moment, as if weighing not just the question, but the weight behind it, the history, the doubt, the quiet insult wrapped in curiosity. Then he looked back up, calm and unshaken. The narrator's voice filled the space, describing his silence as the kind that makes arrogance sweat. And then, without raising his voice, Ibrahim answered in a tone so steady it made the room go still. "It's not the world that isn't ready. It's the few who still believe they own it." A ripple moved through the audience. Whoopi's smile faded just a little, and for the first time, she looked unsure. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone could feel it. The show had just turned into something far bigger than an interview. The silence in the studio deepened as Ibrahim's words settled into the air, their weight pressing down on everyone. Whoopi leaned back slightly, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp and searching. The camera caught the faint twitch of her lips before she spoke again, this time with a hint of steel in her voice. "But critics say your words divide," she said, pausing just long enough for the sting to land. "They say you're too extreme, that you play the victim card." A soft wave of murmurs passed through the audience, like a quiet ripple of agreement or discomfort. Ibrahim didn't interrupt. He didn't even move. His hands rested on the table, still and firm, the calm of someone who had faced far worse than questions. The narrator's voice carried over the silence, pulling the viewers into his past. Images flashed in the mind, the red dust of his village, children running barefoot along roads cracked by trucks that carried away gold and cotton that never returned. He remembered watching older men bow to foreign officials, who smiled wide but looked through them. Roads were built, yes, but they led only to ports. Schools opened, but the lessons taught were not their own. The world had called it progress. He had seen it for what it was, control. His rise had not been sudden. It was born from years of seeing promises break, and hearing people say, "Wait," while their dignity was taken piece by piece. The audience didn't see those memories, but they could feel them in the weight of his pause. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice steady and low. "The people who fear the voice of the oppressed," he said, "always call truth division." The words hung in the air like a quiet verdict. 6. Somewhere backstage, a few journalists exchanged glances. One whispered, "He's unpredictable. Keep it short." Another added, "Don't let him lecture." But one young intern, standing near the control screens, couldn't look away. "He's not what they said he was," she whispered softly, almost to herself. The narration drifted back to the stage, where Whoopi shuffled her cue cards, her jaw tightening. She had expected resistance, not reflection. She had expected anger, not grace. As Ibrahim continued, his voice carried the calm of someone used to being misunderstood. "For centuries," he said, "our pain has been called disorder, our resistance called aggression. But peace without dignity is slavery in disguise." The crowd shifted uneasily. A man in the front row looked down at his hands. A woman in the back bit her lip, blinking slowly. The narration described the air in the room as thick, like truth itself had taken shape and refused to leave. Whoopi's fingers tightened on the edge of her notes. Her face softened for a moment, not in defeat, but in thought. She wasn't angry, she was conflicted. The camera caught it, the flicker of realization that maybe the question she asked wasn't as neutral as she thought. She looked at Ibrahim, who simply met her gaze, calm and patient. The narrator spoke again, describing how years of false stories had painted him as a rebel, a man too loud, too proud, too radical. But tonight, the story was cracking. The audience wasn't just watching an interview anymore. They were watching a curtain being pulled back. Every word Ibrahim spoke peeled away layers of assumption, exposing the quiet hypocrisy buried beneath polite conversations about freedom. The applause didn't come yet, but something deeper did, a silence that felt like listening for the first time. The section closed with a slow zoom on Whoopi's face, her eyes distant, her mind somewhere between defense and discovery. The show was now live across the world. Every screen, every phone, every timeline carried the same headline: Traoré confronts Whoopi on race and power. The room felt smaller now, like the air itself had pulled closer to listen. Whoopi's eyes were steady but softer, as if she knew the next question would decide how the world saw her too. She took a long breath, her voice lower than before. Are you saying we, people like me, are part of the problem? The question hung in the air, sharp yet trembling. For a moment, no one moved. The lights glared down, bouncing off the polished table. The faint sound of the studio air conditioning was the only thing breaking the silence. The camera focused on Ibrahim's face. His eyes reflected the lights above, calm yet heavy, like he was carrying the weight of generations. In a single pause, the narrator described that silence as one that stretched across continents, as if time itself waited for his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. No, Whoopi. The problem is not color, it's comfort. Too many have learned to live peacefully with injustice, as long as it doesn't touch them. The words hit quietly but deeply. The room didn't move, but the shift was visible. The camera crew froze in mid-motion. Audience members leaned forward, their faces unsure whether to look proud or ashamed. Whoopi lowered her cue card slowly, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. She didn't look defensive anymore. She looked human. Ibrahim continued, his voice softer now, but even more piercing. You once stood for voices like mine, he said, but somewhere along the way, the world made you believe you had to choose between truth and acceptance. The camera caught the flicker in her eyes, the brief shimmer of tears that never fully fell. The narration didn't need to explain her silence. It said everything. This wasn't humiliation. It was realization. A lifetime of words, opinions, and applause suddenly felt smaller, compared to a few quiet sentences of truth. The tension in the room cracked slowly, replaced by something heavier: reflection. Then came the applause, not loud, not rushed, but slow and uncertain, like people trying to make peace with what they just heard. The claps echoed softly, each one sounding more like a release than a celebration. Whoopi's voice came out barely above a whisper, fragile but honest. Maybe we all forgot what courage looks like. Her words seemed to float for a moment before fading into the hum of the lights. The camera zoomed out, showing both of them sitting in silence, neither triumphant nor defeated, just still, surrounded by truth. The narrator's voice closed the moment with quiet poetry, describing how the applause faded into an echo that stretched far beyond the studio. Outside, screens lit up around the world. Millions watched the clip, not for drama, not for outrage, but because in a time full of noise, two people had finally dared to face the truth in silence. The words played over footage of Ibrahim, walking through the city lights, his silhouette strong and still. His voice entered softly, almost like a thought carried by the wind. Change begins not when others hear us, but when silence starts to feel heavy enough to break. The camera lingered on him, as he disappeared into the distance, calm, unbothered, and free. A man who hadn't needed to fight to win, only to tell the truth and let the world hear its own silence. The woman who had spent decades giving others a voice had just been reminded what it meant to listen. Meanwhile, Ibrahim walked out of the studio into the quiet night. The rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered under the glow of flickering lights. He walked without guards, without noise, his hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cool air. His phone buzzed again, messages from students, workers, people from across Africa and beyond, all saying the same thing: you spoke for us. The narrator's voice grew softer, reflective, like a heartbeat slowing down after a long race. Justice doesn't always roar, it said. Sometimes it whispers in the silence that follows truth. Somewhere far away, a TV replayed a clip of Whoopi, sitting at her show's closing segment, her tone steady but changed. Sometimes, she said quietly, the hardest part of growth is realizing we stopped listening to the people who remind us where we came from. The words played over footage of Ibrahim, walking through the city lights, his silhouette strong and still. His voice entered softly, almost like a thought carried by the wind. Change begins not when others hear us, but when silence starts to feel heavy enough to break. The camera lingered on him, as he disappeared into the distance, calm, unbothered, and free. A man who hadn't needed to fight to win, only to tell the truth and let the world hear its own silence. The narrator described that silence as one that stretched across continents, as if time itself waited for his answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. No, Whoopi. The problem is not color, it's comfort. Too many have learned to live peacefully with injustice, as long as it doesn't touch them. The words hit quietly but deeply. The room didn't move, but the shift was visible. The camera crew froze in mid-motion. Audience members leaned forward, their faces unsure whether to look proud or ashamed. Whoopi lowered her cue card slowly, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. She didn't look defensive anymore. She looked human. Ibrahim continued, his voice softer now, but even more piercing. "You once stood for voices like mine," he said, "but somewhere along the way, the world made you believe you had to choose between truth and acceptance." The camera caught the flicker in her eyes, the brief shimmer of tears that never fully fell.